They taught me that mercy was a malfunction. In the catechism halls of the penitent legion, we recited it until the words became muscle memory, until the idea of kindness felt like a foreign disease crawling under the skin. I had been a child of the lower decks on the cathedral ship Sanctity of Iron, raised on incense fumes and recycled air, taught to bow before brass shrines bolted to bulkheads. I became a warden adjunct, a minor rank with a major duty, keeping the chain lines moving. When the sermons ended and the drums began, I marched where they pointed and called it faith. The first time I saw the slave holds, I told myself it was necessary. The ship's belly was a maze of riveted corridors and sweating pipes, lit by chain lights that blinked like tired eyes. The air tasted of hot metal and sour breath, thick with machine oil and the sweet rot of unwashed bodies. Thousands sat in rows on grated flooring, collars locked to iron rails, wrists chained in pairs so they could not rise too fast or fall too far. A priest engineer walked between them with a censer in one hand and a shock baton in the other, blessing their suffering and correcting their pace with the same calm rhythm. I watched a boy no older than 12 bite his own lip until it bled, not to cry, but to remember he still had a mouth that belonged to him. My assignment was simple on paper: escort a quota shipment down to Hive Varkun and return with a full manifest of replacement bodies. The Imperium, they called it in the old prayers, but we never used that word out loud anymore. We called it the doctrine like it was a law of physics rather than a choice. Varkun was a continent-sized manufactorum hive on a dead world, a tower of soot-stained cathedrals welded to factories, forever exhaling smoke into a sky that had forgotten blue. The penitent legion supplied guards, and the mechanist choir supplied the machines, and the ecclesiarchs supplied the reasons. The slave supplied everything else: muscle, heat, blood, and the silence that let important people sleep. I had been told this was order, and order was holy. We landed during a shift change, because timing mattered more than lives. Dropship ramps opened like jawbones, and the hive's lower air rushed in with the stench of chemical rain and molten slag. Sirens wailed somewhere deep in the city's ribs, not as warning, but as metronome for work. My squad formed up around the chain line, Lisa with her soot-dark hair tucked beneath a cracked helm, Garran carrying the heavy scattergun that made him feel safe, and Brother Kelm, a veteran with purity seals layered over old scars like paper trying to cover iron. We wore flak coats stamped with the doctrine sigil, our shoulder plates scratched from prior deployments, our boots already sticky from the landing pad's grease. The slaves shuffled between us in staggered columns, collars clinking in a sound that haunted the spaces between prayers. Inside the hive, everything was built to make a person feel small. Buttresses as thick as streets held up ceilings lost in steam, and stained glass icons glowed dimly behind layers of soot, showing saints with serene faces above rivers of exhausted workers. Servitors drifted on tracks overhead, half machine, half something that had once been human, trailing incense and clipped hymns from vox speakers implanted where throats used to be. Every few meters there was a shrine, a steel altar, a strip of candle wax, a box for offerings, and a placard that reminded you that suffering was proof of devotion. The chain line moved past them like a funeral procession that never reached the grave. The slaves stared ahead because looking at anything else meant seeing how wide the world was and how little it cared. I tried to keep my mind inside the approved channels. I repeated the training phrases in my head. Compliance is salvation. Hunger is purification. The body is a tool, and tools do not complain. When a man stumbled, I lifted him by his collar ring and shoved him forward, telling myself I was helping him avoid the lash. When a woman whispered for water, I ignored her, because the schedule did not include mercy. My breath fogged in the cold industrial drafts, and I felt the weight of my rifle strap bite into my shoulder as if it wanted to remind me who I was. Yet I kept noticing the smallest things: the way fingers shook from malnutrition, the bruised skin around collar bolts, the ragged nails torn from prying at chains. Those details slipped under doctrine like grit under a bandage. We delivered the first batch to a processing chapel that smelled like wet ash. The chapel's walls were lined with iron hooks and prayer strips, and a mechanized lectern preached in a thin, synthetic voice about duty to the forge. The slaves were marched through an archway where a machine scanned them with a light that made their bones glow in brief blue shadows. Some were tagged with white seals for manufactorum work, some with red seals for penal battalions, and some with black seals that meant the reclamation vats. I watched a clerk priest stamp a black seal onto a coughing man's forehead without looking up, like he was marking a crate. The man did not resist. He only closed his eyes as if that tiny moment of darkness was a gift. I felt my stomach knot, and my mouth filled with the bitter taste of incense, and for the first time I wondered if obedience could rot you from the inside. After the intake, a supervisor in a gilded respirator approached our squad, his robes edged with machine thread that glittered under chain lights. He thanked us with a blessing that sounded like a transaction, then handed me a slate with the replacement manifest. I expected names or numbers, but it was mostly codes and quotas, lines of data that reduced lives to weights and outputs. "Your return cargo is ready," he said, and his voice rasped through filters like a shovel in gravel. "Fresh stock from the undersumps. Some resistant. The correction collars will teach them." Behind him, I heard screaming, cut short by a hiss and a thud. The supervisor didn't flinch. Neither did the servitor beside him, which carried a tray of hot bolts like communion wafers. We were led to a pen beneath the chapel, where the new shipment waited. They were thinner than the first group, and dirtier, with some grime crusted in their hair and eyes that had learned to look for exits even when none existed. One of them met my gaze directly, a young man with a swollen cheek and a split brow that had been poorly bandaged. His eyes were not pleading, they were measuring, the way a cornered animal assesses a fence. "Warden," he said, and the way he said it made it sound like a curse rather than a title. "Tell me this, if you still remember words that aren't prayers. How many chains do you think it takes before you forget you ever had hands?" I should have struck him for speaking, should have set the example, but I froze under the weight of that question. Brother Kelm noticed my hesitation and stepped in, baton ready, his face hidden behind a respirator marked with old devotional scratches. "Silence!" he barked, and the young man's collar crackled with warning current. The others in the pen flinched like a single organism, bodies tightening in anticipation of pain. I forced myself to move, to play my part, to sign the slate and confirm the count. My fingers trembled as I tapped the runes, and I told myself it was fatigue from the shift, not doubt. But when we marched the new chain line back toward the docks, the young man's words kept looping in my skull, a blasphemous refrain. Every time my gloved hand touched a collar ring, I felt my own skin crawl as if my neck were already fitted with iron. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the small barracks compartment assigned to our squad, the walls vibrating with distant machinery and hymn speakers that never truly turned off. Lisa polished her knife with slow, practiced strokes, her eyes blank in a way that frightened me more than anger ever could. Garan whispered prayers into his palms like he was trying to plug a leak in his soul. Brother Kelm wrote a confession strip, his pen scratching like a rat behind the wall, adding sins that sounded suspiciously like thoughts. I stared at my armor laid out on the cot, the dents and burn marks a record of duties done, and I wondered what parts of me were missing that I hadn't noticed. In the chain light's weak glow, my purity seals looked less like honor and more like labels on a corpse. When the alarm came, it was not the usual work bell. It was the harsh, triple-tone klaxon reserved for unrest, and it shook the compartment like an angry god. Over the vox, a priest's voice demanded calm and compliance, promising absolution for those who reported disloyalty. I stood and buckled my flak plates with hands that felt strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone else. Somewhere below, in the hive's throat, the chain lines had slowed, and slow meant danger. The last thing I heard before we moved out was the faint, ugly sound of iron on iron, not the steady clink of marching colors, but the frantic rattle of someone learning how to pull. And in that sound, I recognized the beginning of a question the doctrine had never prepared me to answer. The corridors toward the lower manufactorum shook with the sound of alarms and running boots, a panicked counterpoint to the usual measured rhythm of labor. Red lumen strips flashed along the walls, turning the incense haze into bleeding shadows that crawled across saints' faces carved in steel. Over the vox, orders overlapped and contradicted one another, each command wrapped in scripture as if holy words could weld chaos back into order. I moved with my squad because moving was easier than thinking, rifle held tight, breath rasping in my mask. Somewhere ahead, the chain lines had broken discipline, and the doctrine demanded correction. We reached the first junction to find it clogged with bodies, not dead yet, but jammed together in a knot of fear and momentum. Slaves pressed against one another, collars sparking as they strained, their combined weight bending the iron rail that guided them. A few had managed to tear loose lengths of chain, crude weapons swinging wildly, clanging off walls and servitor chassis. One servitor lay toppled, its skull casing cracked open, him looping uselessly from a speaker drowned in blood. The sight made my heart hammer in a way combat drills never had. This was not an enemy advance, just people pushing back against the shape of their cages. Brother Kelm shouted litanies of suppression, his voice amplified by his mask, and Garan brought up the scattergun with shaking hands. The first shots were not aimed to kill, at least not officially. Shock rounds burst among the front ranks, blue arcs crawling over bodies, dropping some and enraging others. I fired because everyone else fired, the recoil thudding into my shoulder, each pull of the trigger punctuated by a brief, ugly scream. Lisa moved like a shadow, striking hands that held chain links, her knife flashing and withdrawing with practiced economy. The young man from the pen was there. I saw him through the chaos, his swollen cheek darker now, his eyes fixed not on us but on the rail above. He looped a chain over it and heaved, muscles straining, teeth bared in effort rather than fear. For a heartbeat, I wanted him to succeed, wanted the rail to tear free and prove that iron could fail. The rail held. The chain snapped instead, whipping back and cracking across his collar. He went down hard, convulsing as the correction current surged, the smell of burnt hair and skin cutting through incense. The rest of the line faltered, momentum bleeding away into sobs and whimpers. Orders crackled over the vox, satisfied now, demanding containment and processing of agitators. I lowered my rifle, my arms suddenly heavy, and stepped forward to secure restraints. As I did, the young man's eyes fluttered open, and he laughed, a wet, broken sound that made my stomach twist. "Still hands," he gasped, barely audible. "For now." I said nothing, because there was nothing in the catechism for that. We spent hours restoring order, dragging bodies to side corridors, reattaching chains, replacing broken collars with heavier models. The doctrine had contingencies for everything except how it felt to kneel on someone's back while tightening iron around their throat. My knees ached, my gloves slick with sweat and other fluids I did not name. Every so often, a priest-engineer would arrive to bless the work, daubing oil and reciting absolutions that landed like cold ash. The slaves were quieter after, not calm but hollowed, their resistance burned down to embers that glowed behind their eyes. I told myself this was success, because the alarms eventually fell silent. When we returned to the barracks level, the hymn speakers were louder, compensating for the disruption with extra devotion. My armor felt heavier than before, as if it had absorbed something it did not want to give back. Garan vomited into a waste grate, whispering apologies to a saint whose name he could barely remember. Lisa cleaned her blade again, longer this time, her jaw tight, eyes fixed on nothing. Brother Kelm gathered us for a brief prayer, his voice steady, thanking the doctrine for guiding our hands. I mouthed the words and felt them scrape my throat raw. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams that smelled like metal and sounded like chains dragging across stone. I saw my hands in those dreams, opening and closing, always empty, always leaving marks on skin that never healed. When I woke, my palms ached as if I had been clenching them all night. A summons waited on my slate, stamped with the sigil of the correction office. We were to escort a group of identified agitators to a secondary facility deeper in the hive, a place whispered about in mess halls but never described. Brother Kelm's eyes lingered on the order longer than usual before he nodded and told us to gear up. The descent took us through levels of the hive I had never seen, where the walls sweated chemical runoff and the air burned the lungs even through filters. Gothic arches gave way to raw, utilitarian tunnels, pipes exposed and vibrating with unseen flows. The prisoners shuffled ahead of us, collars linked in short chains that limited movement without encouraging unity. Among them was the young man, his movements stiff, a fresh bandage around his neck where the collar had bitten deep. He glanced back once, recognition flickering, then looked away as if I were already a memory he did not want. The facility itself squatted at the end of the tunnels like a wound that refused to close. Its gates were thick slabs of reinforced steel, etched with prayers and warning sigils, guarded by silent wardens whose armor bore no unit markings. Inside, the light was dimmer, the incense heavier, tinged with something sweet and nauseating. Rows of restraint frames lined the walls, each fitted with cables and injector ports, each bearing the scars of use. A robed overseer greeted us, face hidden behind a mask shaped like a serene saint, voice smooth as polished stone. "These ones will be corrected for redeployment," the overseer said, as if discussing damaged equipment. We transferred custody with the efficiency drilled into us, unclipping chains and reattaching them to the facility's fixtures. The prisoners were processed one by one, strapped into frames, collars interfacing with control nodes that hummed softly. I avoided looking at their faces, focusing instead on the procedures, the runes on my slate, the comforting tyranny of steps to follow. When it was the young man's turn, he did not struggle. As the frame locked him in place, he finally looked at me again, and there was no hatred there, only a tired curiosity. "Do you still feel them?" he asked quietly, nodding toward my hands. Before I could answer, the overseer initiated the cycle, and his question drowned in a chorus of machinery. We were dismissed after that, told our presence was no longer required. As we left, the doors sealing behind us with a final, reverent clang, I realized my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I clenched them into fists, nails biting into my palms until the pain grounded me in the corridor. Brother Kelm noticed but said nothing, his own shoulders sagging under a weight I had never seen him carry before. The doctrine said correction brought renewal, that broken tools could be reforged. Walking back up through the hive's layers, past shrines and chains and the endless labor of the enslaved, I wondered what happened to the pieces that could not be put back together. And for the first time since I had learned to pray, I feared the answer might include me. The days after the correction detail blurred into a single, grinding march of duty. The hive resumed its rhythm, alarms replaced by the steady thunder of machinery and the murmured prayers pumped through every corridor. Official reports labeled the unrest resolved, agitators processed, productivity restored. On paper, the doctrine had won another quiet victory. In my body, it felt like something had lodged itself between my ribs and refused to move. My left gauntlet actuator began to stick 2 shifts later, a minor fault noted during inspection. The tech adept said grit had worked its way into the joint, probably from the lower tunnels, and applied oil while chanting a maintenance hymn. As he worked, I noticed how my hand twitched even when the servo was still, fingers flexing as if remembering pressure that was no longer there. He asked if I'd experienced neural feedback issues, and I told him no, because admitting anything else would mean paperwork, interviews, and prayers meant to burn weakness out of you. He sealed the actuator and stamped approval, never looking at my face. The machine was fixed, but the memory wasn't. We were reassigned to internal security patrols, watching over chain lines and labor chapels rather than escorting shipments. It was meant to be a calming duty, a reminder of order maintained. I stood for hours on gantries overlooking production floors where slaves hauled glowing ingots from furnaces that screamed like living things. Their collars synced with the work rhythm, pulsing gently to keep them moving in time, a mechanical shepherding of flesh. Above them, stained glass saints looked down with expressions carved to suggest love, though soot and heat had warped them into something closer to indifference. I watched people stumble, watched overseers intervene with prods and prayers, and felt my jaw tighten until it ached. Lisa spoke less than before, if that was possible, her movements sharp and precise, like she was afraid to waste energy on anything unnecessary. Garan avoided the edges of gantries now, keeping his back to walls, his eyes darting at sudden noises. Brother Kelm grew more devout, adding extra strips to his armor, murmuring confessions under his breath between patrols. I listened to them and wondered which response the doctrine preferred: silence, fear, or faith pushed to the point of fracture. When I caught my reflection in a polished panel, my eyes looked older, set deeper into my skull, as if the hive had started hollowing me out from the inside. The dreams returned, sharper this time. I dreamed of chains growing into my wrists, iron veins pulsing under skin, each heartbeat tightening their grip. In one dream, I stood on a gantry and looked down to see myself in the line below, collar locked, eyes lifted in recognition. I woke with a strangled gasp, the barracks hymn still playing, my heart racing like I'd been running. Sleep became something I endured rather than sought, a necessary shutdown that always carried a cost. I began to understand why some veterans drank industrial solvents or volunteered for frontline deployments instead. During one patrol, we passed a shrine that had been newly installed, its steel surface still bright beneath fresh purity seals. A priest was lecturing a gathered group of slaves, his voice amplified, explaining that their suffering powered the light of humanity itself. "You are the fuel," he said warmly, "and fuel does not question the flame." The slaves knelt as best they could, chains clinking, heads bowed. One woman near the front swayed, exhaustion pulling her down inch by inch until her forehead touched the metal floor. The priest paused only long enough to prod her upright with his staff before continuing. I felt something twist in my chest, a hot, dangerous thing that doctrine named heresy. The report that changed everything came at the end of a long shift, delivered quietly on Brother Kelm's slate. Another disturbance had been detected, not a riot this time but a pattern. Small delays, machines running inefficiently, workers collapsing at statistically inconvenient moments. The correction office suspected organized sabotage, subtle and patient. Names were flagged for observation, including several already processed at the secondary facility. One designation froze me in place when I read it. The young man, identified now by a code and a labor sector, marked as redeployed rather than reclaimed. He had survived correction, reforged into something functional. The thought unsettled me more than if he had simply vanished. We were ordered to locate and observe his unit, to identify any lingering influence. The manufactorum he worked in was deep in the hive, a cathedral of pistons and presses where heat shimmered like a living veil. The noise was constant, a physical force that pressed against the skull and rattled the teeth. We took positions on an upper walkway, watching the lines below. It took me longer than I liked to spot him, thinner now, movements economical, collar scars visible even from above. He worked without hesitation, without wasted motion, exactly as the overseers desired. For a time, nothing happened. Then I noticed the smallest irregularities, a tool passed a fraction too slowly, a press cycle delayed just enough to throw off the next station, a worker helped up not immediately but after checking the overseer's position. It was subtle, buried in the noise and heat, but once seen it couldn't be unseen. The young man moved through it all like a conductor, his glances brief but precise. He never looked up at us, yet I had the distinct, unsettling sense that he knew we were there. That knowledge sat heavy in my gut, equal parts fear and a traitorous spark of admiration. Brother Kelm confirmed the pattern and ordered an intervention. The Vox crackled with authorization codes, and overseers began converging on the line. The workers sensed it before they saw it, tension rippling through bodies already bent to breaking. When the first overseer grabbed a man by the collar, the delay cascaded into chaos. Tools clattered, presses jammed, alarms began to howl. The young man stepped forward, hands raised, saying something lost in the noise. An overseer struck him anyway, baton flashing. The line surged, not forward this time but inward, bodies closing ranks around him. We moved fast, dropping down access ladders, weapons up. The scene below was confusion and heat and screaming metal. I pushed through bodies, shoving, shouting commands that dissolved in the din. I reached the young man just as an overseer raised his baton again. Without thinking, I grabbed the overseer's arm and yanked it down, my grip iron tight. The overseer turned on me, shock and fury visible even through his mask. "Warden!" he shouted, and in that single word was accusation, betrayal, and the weight of everything I had been taught. I released him instantly, stepping back, hands raised in a gesture that mirrored the slaves. The moment stretched, fragile as glass. Then Brother Kelm's voice cut through the noise, ordering restraint, doctrine reasserted. The overseer struck the young man again, harder this time, and he went down, curling around himself. Order was restored with brutal efficiency, lines reformed, saboteurs dragged away. No one mentioned my intervention aloud, but I felt eyes on me as we withdrew, measuring, recalibrating. That night, as I scrubbed my hands raw in the barracks wash station, I realized they still remembered. They remembered the weight of another person's arm, the instinctive pull, the brief, dangerous choice. The doctrine said iron did not remember, that tools did not choose. Staring at my reddened skin, I knew that was a lie. And once you saw that lie for what it was, it became impossible to forget. The scrutiny began quietly, the way rot does, without announcement or ceremony. My patrol routes changed by a few meters, my access codes lagged half a second longer than before, and my slate requests were answered with polite delays wrapped in scripture. Brother Kelm stopped correcting my posture during prayers and instead watched me with the careful neutrality of a man measuring a fall. Lisa avoided my eyes altogether, and Garan flinched whenever my name was spoken over the vox. The doctrine never accused you directly at first, it audited you, weighing silence against deviation until the scales tipped themselves. 2 days after the Manufactorum incident, I was summoned to a chapel of verification, a windowless chamber lined with cog-toothed icons and confession stalls that smelled of old incense and fear. A verifier waited inside, robed in layered cloth stiff with purity seals, face hidden behind a mask etched with symmetrical prayers. The air hummed softly, the sound of machines listening. He invited me to kneel, his voice calm, almost kind, and asked me to recount my service history in precise detail. I spoke for what felt like hours, my words recorded, cross-checked, weighed against doctrinal expectation, every pause noted as potential deviation. When he asked about the Manufactorum disruption, I felt the trap close. I described events accurately but clinically, excising impulse and intention, framing my intervention as a momentary misinterpretation of threat vectors. The verifier tilted his head as if listening to something beyond the room, then asked why my heart rate had spiked when I made contact with the overseer. I did not know how to answer that without condemning myself. So I spoke of fatigue, of adrenaline, of the body's unreliability under stress. He accepted the explanation with a nod that told me nothing, and dismissed me with a blessing that felt like a seal being pressed onto my fate. After that, the dreams changed again. I no longer saw myself chained. Instead, I stood in endless corridors lined with doors, each door bearing my name stamped in iron. Behind some I heard prayers, behind others screaming, and behind a few only the soft, steady sound of machinery at work. I woke each time before choosing a door, my heart racing, my mouth tasting of ash. During waking hours, I caught myself scanning walls for hidden lenses, lowering my voice even when alone. The hive had always watched us, but now I felt its gaze as something intimate, invasive, like fingers probing for weakness. Our next assignment confirmed my fears. We were ordered to assist the correction office with a reclamation sweep, collecting workers deemed unfit for continued labor due to inefficiency, non-compliance, or spiritual decay. It was an escalation, a task meant to test obedience under moral strain. The list included entire sections of the Manufactorum where the subtle sabotage had occurred. Brother Kelm read the order aloud, his voice steady, then looked at each of us in turn, lingering on me just long enough to register disappointment. "We serve," he said finally, and no one contradicted him. The sweep was efficient and merciless. We moved through dormitory blocks at shift's end, when exhaustion made resistance clumsy and hope thin. Names were called, collars activated, bodies dragged from bunks still warm from shared heat. Some begged, some cursed, most went limp with resignation. I followed procedure with mechanical precision, my hands performing tasks my mind refused to claim ownership of. Each time I locked restraints, I felt that remembered pressure again, the ghost of a choice I had made and could not unmake. We reached a lower dorm where the young man's unit had been reassigned. The air there was stale, the lighting poor, walls pitted from decades of neglect. When his code was called, there was a murmur, a subtle shifting of bodies that spoke of bonds formed under iron. He stepped forward without protest, thinner still, eyes shadowed but alert. He looked at me once, recognition flaring, and gave the smallest nod, as if acknowledging a shared secret. That nod felt heavier than any chain I had lifted. As we escorted the group toward transport, something inside me fractured. The doctrine demanded I see tools, quotas, corrective measures. Instead, I saw patterns of breath, the way fear tightened shoulders, the way hope flickered even now. When a woman stumbled, I caught her arm before she fell, steadying her instead of shoving. Brother Kelm noticed, his jaw tightening, but said nothing. The silence between us was loud with implication. At the transport bay, a correction prefect took custody, his armor pristine, his voice devoid of inflection. He reviewed the manifest, pausing when he reached the young man's designation. "This one has history," he said mildly. "Ensure compliance protocols are fully engaged." I felt the words like a verdict. As the prisoners were loaded, the young man spoke again, quietly, just for me. "You chose once," he said. "That matters, even if it costs you." Before I could respond, the bay doors sealed, cutting him off mid-breath. The return to barracks was silent. Lisa finally spoke, her voice low, asking what I thought would happen next. I told her the truth, that I did not know. Garan prayed harder than I had ever seen, his knuckles white, his lips moving frantically. Brother Kelm stayed behind after dismissal, stopping me at the threshold. He did not threaten me, did not accuse. He simply asked if I still believed obedience was salvation. The question hung between us, heavy and dangerous, and I realized there was no answer that would not change everything. That night, the audit concluded. An order appeared on my slate, stamped with finality. I was to report for doctrinal reassignment, effective immediately, pending further evaluation. The location was unspecified, the duration indefinite. I sat on my cot, armor half removed, listening to the hive breathe through its vents. The chains outside kept moving, the work never stopped, and somewhere below, reclamation machines sang their hymns. I understood then that slavery in war was not just about bodies bound to labor, but about choices narrowed until obedience felt like the only path left. And as I rose to answer the summons, I knew that whatever waited for me next would demand a final accounting of the hands I still remembered as my own. The reassignment chamber sat beneath the hive like a thought buried too deep to name. I was escorted there alone, my slate confiscated, my weapon taken with ritual care, each removal accompanied by a prayer meant to soothe what was about to be broken. The corridor walls grew narrower as I descended, their surfaces polished smooth by centuries of passing bodies and unseen hands. Vents whispered confessions in recycled air, and the lights dimmed until shadows pooled thick and heavy at my feet. By the time I reached the door, I felt stripped down to something small and dangerously exposed. Inside, the chamber was circular, its ceiling lost in darkness, its floor etched with concentric sigils that drew the eye inward. Chains hung from above, not for restraint but as symbols, their links engraved with script too small to read without leaning close. A single chair waited at the center, bolted to the floor, its metal surface worn by countless occupants. Opposite it stood a tribunal engine, a towering construct of brass and steel, vox grills arranged like a listening face. Incense burned in slow curls around it, thick and cloying, carrying a scent that made my head swim. I was instructed to sit. The chair's restraints closed around my wrists and ankles, not painfully, but with undeniable finality. A servo descended, fitting a circlet around my temples, its touch cold and intimate. "This is not punishment," intoned the tribunal engine, its voice layered, multiple tones harmonized into something almost gentle. "This is clarification." I swallowed and tried to steady my breathing, telling myself that truth had nothing to fear from examination, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. The questioning began softly, probing memories from my earliest service. Faces, names, dates, all drawn out and weighed. The circlet hummed as it interfaced with my thoughts, surfacing images I had not summoned in years. The first time I fired a weapon, the first time I watched someone die because I hesitated. With each memory, the engine adjusted its tone, its questions growing narrower, more precise. When it reached the manufacturum incident, the air seemed to thicken, every sound amplified. "Explain the deviation," it asked, and there was no room left for doctrine's safe abstractions. I tried to frame it as error, as fatigue, as a misread of authority. The circlet warmed, a subtle pressure building as the engine listened not just to my words but to what lay beneath them. Images bled through despite my efforts. The young man's eyes, the instinctive pull on the overseer's arm, the fleeting certainty that what I was doing mattered. The pressure spiked, pain blooming bright and sharp behind my eyes. "Clarify," the engine demanded, and I screamed, The sound ripped from me before I could stop it. When the pain receded, I was sobbing, humiliation burning hotter than the ache. The engine was silent for a long moment, processing, recalibrating. "You experienced empathic override," it said at last. "A recognized cognitive fault under prolonged exposure to correction environments." Relief fluttered weakly in my chest until it continued. Such faults compromise efficiency and threaten systemic stability. I knew then this was not about guilt or innocence, but utility. The doctrine did not ask why you faltered, only whether you could still be used. The verdict was delivered without ceremony. I was unfit for continued command or oversight roles, but my service record and physical capacity rendered me too valuable for reclamation. Instead, I was reassigned to a penal auxiliary unit attached to a frontier war zone. Exposure to externalized violence often resolves internal deviation, the engine explained. Should it fail, your utility will be reassessed. The restraints released, and I nearly collapsed, legs trembling beneath me. As I was escorted out, the chains above clinked softly, a sound that followed me like a benediction. Preparation for transfer was swift and impersonal. My armor was returned, stripped of insignia, purity seals replaced with a single mark denoting penal status. Lisa found me as I packed, her face pale, her usual composure cracked. She did not try to stop me or offer comfort. She simply pressed a small charm into my palm, a piece of scrap metal etched with a crude saint's face. "For remembering," she said, and turned away before I could respond. Garan wept openly, and Brother Kelm embraced me, whispering a prayer that sounded dangerously like an apology. The transport ship was older than the sanctity of iron, its interior scarred and utilitarian, shrines smaller and more numerous as if compensating for something lacking. I was chained with others like me, men and women marked by failure or doubt, our collars linked to a central rail. The irony was not lost on me, but it no longer burned the way it once had. As the ship lifted, engines roaring, I felt the hive recede, its endless labor continuing without pause. I wondered if the young man was still alive somewhere within it, if my choice had truly mattered. During transit, I found a strange clarity settling over me. The fear was still there, coiled and ready, but beneath it lay a quiet resolve I had never known. I understood now that slavery in this endless war was not confined to chains and collars. It lived in doctrines that narrowed thought, in systems that measured worth only by output, in the quiet acceptance of cruelty as necessity. I did not know what awaited me on the frontier, only that it would be honest in its brutality, stripped of the hive's sanctified lies. As the ship entered warp, the lights flickered, and prayers rose from every chained throat. I closed my eyes and held onto Lisa's charm, its edges biting into my skin. The tribunal engine had listened and judged, and in doing so had freed me from the illusion of safety obedience offered. Whatever came next would test me in ways I could not yet imagine. But for the first time since the chain-light corridors of my youth, I felt the weight of choice settle back into my hands, heavy and real, waiting to be answered. The frontier warzone greeted us with fire and noise, honest in a way the hive had never been. The sky above the trench world was a bruised gray, torn constantly by artillery flashes that lit the mud like diseased lightning. We were unloaded under prayer and threat, collars unlocked only long enough to hand us rifles before being sealed again in a looser configuration, one that allowed us to fight without letting us forget who we were. The air smelled of propellant, rot, and something metallic that coated the tongue. Here, there were no manufactorums to hide behind, no sermons about productivity, only survival measured in minutes. They called us an auxiliary penal cohort, a polite way of saying expendable. Our officers wore different marks, their armor stripped of ornament, their voices hoarse from shouting orders over the guns. I was assigned to a trench section that had already been shelled into something barely recognizable, its walls sagging, its icons shattered and half buried in mud. The men and women beside me carried the same look I had seen in the slave holds, resignation mixed with a thin, stubborn spark. We were all chained to something, but here the chains were visible, honest, rattling with every step. The first assault came before I had learned everyone's names. Sirens wailed, a different tone from the hive's alarms, more animal, less ceremonial. We climbed ladders slick with rain and blood, boots slipping, hands trembling, and charged into a no-man's land churned into a graveyard of wire and broken bodies. I fired until my rifle overheated, the recoil numbing my shoulder, the noise erasing thought. Fear stripped everything down to essentials, and in that stripping, something fell away. There was no doctrine here to interpret my actions, no verifier to listen for deviation, only the immediate consequence of each choice. I saw people fall, some screaming, some silent, and I learned quickly not to look back. The enemy was faceless behind smoke and distance, reduced to muzzle flashes and silhouettes. When a comrade stumbled, I grabbed them without thinking, hauled them into a shell hole, returned fire until the pressure eased. The motion was the same as it had been in the hive, the remembered weight of another body, but here it was sanctioned, even praised. The realization hit me with a bitter laugh that turned into a sob. I swallowed hard. The system condemned the impulse in one place and rewarded it in another, and called both justice. Days blurred together in cycles of attack and recovery, sleep stolen in minutes, meals reduced to nutrient paste eaten with shaking hands. My armor grew heavier with mud and dents, my body mapped with bruises and small burns. The collar chafed constantly, a reminder that even here, even now, freedom was conditional. Yet in the trenches, among others marked for failure, I found something like truth. We spoke quietly at night, sharing fragments of past lives, names of hives and ships, losses that sounded the same no matter where they began. No one preached. No one pretended suffering had meaning beyond endurance. During a lull, as artillery thundered in the distance, I took out Lisa's charm, its crude saint worn smooth by my fingers. I thought of the young man in the hive, of his question about hands and forgetting. I did not know if he lived, or if my single choice had spared him anything lasting. What I knew was that the chains had taught me what obedience cost, and the war was teaching me what it did not have to take. They could bind my body, direct my violence, audit my thoughts until they screamed, but they could not fully erase the knowledge of choice once it had been felt. On the 7th day, our section was overrun. The order to fall back came too late, Vox drowned by explosions. I found myself cut off with a handful of others, huddled in a crater as fire rained around us. Ammunition ran low, fear ran high, and someone began to pray out loud, words tumbling over each other. I joined in, not out of doctrine, but out of the human need to be heard. When the final push came, I stood and fired until the rifle clicked empty, then kept standing, refusing to drop until it was over or I was. We survived. Barely. Reinforcements arrived, the enemy broke, and the crater became just another scar on the landscape. As medics moved among us, I realized my collar had been shattered by shrapnel, its lights dead, its grip slack. No one noticed. No one had time. I could have slipped away into the chaos, vanished into the smoke and mud. The thought lingered, heavy and tempting. Instead, I stayed, helped the wounded, took up a fallen rifle. The choice was mine, unobserved, unrecorded, and that made it real in a way nothing else ever had. I do not know how long I will last on this world, or what final accounting awaits me. I know only this: slavery in war is not just chains and orders, but the slow erosion of the self until obedience feels like safety. I felt that erosion, and I felt the moment it stopped, the moment something held fast inside me despite everything. If this testimony survives me, let it stand as proof that even in the darkest systems, something human endures, stubborn and inconvenient. The chains took much, but they did not take everything.